From Genesis 30, 25 through 43. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children, for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He added, "Name your wages and I will pay them." And Jacob said to him, "You know how I have worked for you and how your livestock have fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household?" "What shall I give you?" he asked. "Don't give me anything," Jacob replied. "But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove them, every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages, and my honesty will testify for me in the future whenever you check on the wages you have paid me. Any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored, will be considered stolen." "Agreed," said Laban. "Let it be as you have said." And that same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob, however, took fresh cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs, so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they made it in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the trough in front of the animals so that they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way, the man grew extremely prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. That ends our reading.
There's a lot of scheming and cheating going on in that passage. I don't know if you picked up on it or not. I like Jacob's line, my honesty will be my testimony. My sermon will be my testimony, and you can judge me on that, but be gentle. We've heard a lot about cheating in sports lately over the last several years, haven't we? There's allegedly Tom Brady and Bill Belichick for the Patriots. Allegedly. There's always a lot of chatter right around the NBA playoffs about how the NBA is rigged, although it's apparently not, since the Cleveland Cavaliers actually won, and we know that no one in Cleveland is supposed to win. Now Buffalo is the only really genuinely cursed sports town left. There have been many cheating scandals in cycling, doping of various kinds going on. Lance Armstrong, here we go, ugh, mean Lance, was once a household name. Even if you didn't like being on a bicycle, you knew who he was. But after it was revealed how he used performance-enhancing drugs after his post-cancer cycling career, he's been banned from cycling, and his reputation as an athlete is disgraced. Alex Rodriguez of the New York Yankees falls into that category, though he wasn't banned from baseball. You know, everyone's always looking for an edge in pro sports. There's so much money at stake. And most try to go right up to the line without crossing over. We know that there's a lot of gray area. Think of the size of goalie equipment in the NHL. Or think about what happens on the bottom of a pile in the NFL when football players pile up. But recently we've had a sports cheating scandal like we haven't had since the East German swim team in the 1980s. I'm talking about Russia's epic track and field cheating scandal. Have you read any of the details of this doping scandal? It's really unbelievable. It was state-sponsored cheating and doping on a grand scale, complete with bribes to officials, whistleblowers who fled for their lives, death threats, and it's been kind of a crazy story. You should really look it up and read about the drama surrounding the Russian track and field team. In the end, the result was Russia's track and field team being banned from the Olympics in Rio this year. And there's talk that the whole entire Russian Olympic team might be banned. The athletes who are clean, who still want to compete from Russia, now have to compete under the Olympic flag instead of their own. And chances are, if you do compete, you probably don't want to go home. Now that's a pretty dramatic example, but cheating in professional and Olympic sports is probably pretty wide-ranging. I mean, the reputation is not too good, right? We hope that cheaters don't win, but they often do. Now, isn't the ultimate goal of cheating just to win and win at any price? After all, winners take all. Winners get the money, they get the sponsors, they get the fame, they get their names in history. Second place is easily forgotten. In the 90s, the Chicago Bulls won 6 NBA championships. Does anybody remember who they played? Barely, right? Detroit? I could name them. You know, we could stand up here and think of them. But it's the Bulls that we remember. It's Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen that we remember. People cheat because they assume that with victory, they will come some kind of lasting achievement or lasting happiness. And sometimes it works, and sometimes people get caught. But we know that we live in a cheating culture. I mean, what's the phrase? If you're not cheating, you're not really trying, right? Have you heard that? You know, if the Bible had chapter titles, we would probably name this episode between Jacob and his uncle Laban, "If You're Not Cheating, You're Not Really Trying." Now, if you recall at this point in Jacob's life, he's stolen his brother Esau's blessing, he's had to flee for his life, and he's had a vision from God. We've covered that so far in the series. If you look at Genesis 29, he arrives to the relative safety of his uncle's home, but soon he finds out he's met his match in his uncle Laban. So Jacob starts working for Laban, and he wants to marry his daughter Rachel. So Laban says, "Hey, Jacob, work for 7 years, and you can have my daughter. I'll give you the blessing for your marriage." And then at the last minute, Laban switches Rachel for his other daughter, Leah. Now, Jacob wouldn't have known because they would have been heavily veiled. So imagine his surprise when he wakes up next to somebody else the next morning. Now Laban does eventually give Rachel to Jacob, but not until he agrees to work for Laban for 7 more years. How do you like that, ladies? Being traded around like some cattle, right? You know, it's funny. Whenever people say they want to go back to a biblical understanding of marriage, I said, so you want all women to just be property and traded around? Is that what it is? Anyway.
Some of them do.
Some of them do, yeah. It's complicated. And Laban's busted deal with Jacob has long-ranging consequences. And we can see that play out all the way to Genesis 50 and actually beyond. If you read on, you'll see this bitter rivalry develop between the sons of Leah and the sons of Rachel. We finally come to our passage this morning, though, in Genesis 30. And you can see in the beginning how you can see Jacob and Laban kind of circling each other. They're so polite, so polite to each other. They're really scheming to cheat. Laban agrees to give Jacob all the spotted and streaked livestock, and then shortly before he turns the flock over to Jacob, he takes all the spotted and streaked livestock away and gives them to his sons. And then he puts some distance between them so he thinks that Jacob doesn't know. Now Jacob, for his part, he's catch this bizarre ritual about poplar and yeah, it's very strange. He sets these streaked branches in front of these mating goats and sheep. Now, we know that this can't work. It's bizarre, right? But this is what Genesis 30 says in verse 43. It says, in this way, this strange way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous, and he came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. God blesses Jacob, even though Jacob just thinks he's cheating his uncle. It's a strange story, isn't it? You should definitely go back and reread it again after the sermon. And I admit, when I looked at this passage again, I set these scriptures like months in advance. And when I come back to them the week of to write the sermon, sometimes I think to myself, what have I given myself here? I mean, what's the lesson here? Is there anything that we can learn from this cheating and scheming that goes on between Jacob and Laban? I mean, Jacob is supposed to be God's man. Yet here he is, scheming around with his uncle. He gets pulled back into this life of duplicity that got him in trouble in the first place. And yet, through it all, God seems determined to bless Jacob by making his harebrained, streaked, and spotted cattle scheme actually work. So, is that the lesson? That God will bless cheating if that's just a part of the plan? I think some professional athletes would like that. But I don't think that's the lesson. I hope so. I hope it's not. I think this passage is filled with a lot of details that can kind of distract us from the whole point of what's going on. Think about Jacob's situation. For 14 years, he has basically been stuck. Take a look at Genesis 30, verses 25 and 26. It says, after Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me on my way, so I can go back to my homeland. Give me my wives and children, for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you. He's been working for his uncle, and other than his wives and children, he's penniless. 14 years, and he doesn't have any wealth to show for it. He's completely dependent on the good graces of Laban, and Laban doesn't really have that many good graces. Now, he could have been stuck with Laban forever. But however we view this passage, this incident, this event, was the means by which God got Jacob out of Laban's grasp. And like it does so often, the book of Genesis doesn't really try to preach a morality tale here, especially when it comes to this cheating incident, as much as it just tells God's story of this unfolding plan through Jacob. There's no moral to the story here, is what I'm saying. A 14-year delay is a long time. Anybody wait 14 years for anything? If somebody said you had to wait 14 years for something, you might say, that's fine, I'll go do something else. I don't need to wait 14 years. 14 years is a long time, and he's getting antsy. He needs to move beyond Laban. There's a world to see, and I'm sure that Jacob wants to find out what God's promises really mean to him. Because surely it can't mean being tied to his uncle his whole life. Well, we live in a culture that absolutely demands conformity. I know that everyone says we're free to do whatever we want, but if we defy social or cultural conventions with our freedom, or if we say the wrong thing, no one ever gets the benefit of the doubt. There was recently a kind of a funny thing about how stars, when they say something wrong, they have to go on this public apology speaking tour before they get back in people's good graces. Resisting the urge to cheat and to take shortcuts is really difficult for us. Everybody wants the secret. If you're not cheating, you're not really trying, right? And when things take a long time, when we feel stuck, when we feel like our lives have hit the pause button, we're kind of in a place where we're tempted to try and find an easy way out in order to get moving again. But looking for a shortcut when things get difficult or when things get stuck, sometimes it leads to disaster. Sometimes a direction that looks like a way out can actually get us more lost than we already are. Sometimes there are times that we need to act, and sometimes we just need to be patient. Jacob thought he was cheating and winning with this really strange scheme. But God was the one who was moving him out and moving him on. In other words, Jacob was allowed to move out because it was simply his time. God's timing was there. And God provided a way for Jacob to get out, and he moved. You know, a lot of people, Christians even, get upset with the idea that we ought to wait, that we ought to pray for things carefully before we act. And I hear people say it a lot. Enough prayer already. Let's just go. Let's just go do something. And I get that urge to want to go do something. We don't want to wait around. We don't want to feel like we're stuck. But in an age where we rush headlong into everything and we expect instant gratification, waiting patiently on God for wisdom about an issue or a direction to move seems like the thing that we ought to do more often. You know, the world doesn't need fewer contemplative Christians. It needs more of them. The world doesn't need fewer contemplative Christians. It needs more of them. Because we need to think about who we are and whose we are. As Paul says in Romans 12, verse 2, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. You think about the scale of the problems facing the world and the church. Think about the expense of addressing those concerns. If things are not thought of well, if we don't really prayerfully approach these problems, if God's wisdom isn't sought out, plans are more likely to fail. Resources are more likely to be wasted. You know, it wasn't overnight that Jacob built up this flock. It would have been a process that would have taken even more years to complete. I bet you he was stuck with Laban for 20 years. Sometimes the process of making the right move, of waiting for God, can look like sitting around, but it's not. Jacob was very active in his plan. There were a lot of things for him to do in the meantime. The same is true for us. Careful and prayerful planning means there's actually a lot for us to do while we wait. It doesn't mean ignoring the problem or hoping it'll go away. You know, we can teach the world about thinking again. We can teach the world how to be deliberate instead of dashing headlong into madness like we so often do. I know that the issues that face our church and some of the issues of our community and the nation are very complicated. I mentioned the problem of addiction. It's an issue that we seem to only address on the surface. And if we're really going to solve a problem like addiction, it's going to take a lot of hard work. It's going to take a lot of wisdom and a lot of patience. Patience that we really don't want to give. Don't be rash. I'm urging all of us, when we think about whatever issues are facing us in this moment, whatever decisions you might have, to seek out wisdom, to plan carefully, and to move in God's time. That may take longer in the short run, but the results in the long run will be better. You know, cheaters don't always win. Sometimes they do. But often cheating and shortcutting comes at a terrible price, and it comes back to bite the person in the end. Seldom does somebody have success over the long term by engaging in a plan that cuts corners. Last week we briefly touched on Jacob's memorial rock. Jacob, remember, he fell asleep on a rock and he had a dream. I mean, no wonder he had a dream. You probably dream strange things too if you used a rock for a pillow. But when he woke up, after that vision from God, he woke up in the morning and he set that rock up. And he poured oil over it. And he said, this is a memorial to God's faithfulness to me. And if God really does deliver on these promises that I've had in this dream, I'll always remember this rock. And I'll understand that God was with me. I wonder what happened to Jacob's rock at Bethel. Do you ever wonder? There's all these times and places in the Old Testament where people set up these rocks or these pillars. I wonder what happened to them. Rocks don't go away very easily, do they? I mean, they stick around. But every now and then they can be moved. They can get washed away with storms. They can be pushed around by circumstances. Sometimes we can forget about those rocks and pillars in our lives, those stepstones that God gives us. When we're being tossed around, when we feel stuck or we feel uncertain, it's important to go back and unearth those touchstones in our lives, those places where God really touched us. Because it's easy to lose sight of the faith that we already have. It's easy to lose sight of the experiences with God that we've already had. Sometimes the best thing we can do when we're trying to go and seek God's wisdom is to look for that rock of faith that we already have within us, that God has given us. Because that rock reminds us of who we are and whose we are. It reminds us that just as we got through something before, we're going to get through this again, whatever it is that we're facing. The story of Jacob and Laban is disturbing in its details. Go ahead and read all of 29 and 30 in your free time this week. It's great beach reading, don't have nothing else to do. But if we pan out and we get the bigger picture, we see a wider wisdom at work. And it's that wider wisdom that I'm urging you to seek out this morning.